Hello, everyone. I'm Valora Washington, CEO of the CAYL Institute, and it is my pleasure to invite you to this webinar with the Community Advocates for Young Learners. It's my honor to welcome you to the 2022 CAYL Catalyst webinar series. Our goal is to bring you timely, relevant, and immediately actionable topics of interest about young children and the people who raise and care for them and educate them. For 2022, CAYL is going to focus on three things: imagine, innovate, and impact. For the first few months, we're going to focus on the first part of our theme, which is imagine. In the early childhood education field, we often talk about the importance of fostering children's imagination because we know that imagination fosters their social and intellectual growth. And at CAYL, we believe that using our imagination is also a constructive way for us as adults to envision a different, a better world for our children. That's why last year, our theme revolved around our book entitled Changing the Game for Young Learners. And this year, we want to emphasize that we, as the adults in their lives, can be architects of these positive changes, as illustrated in this year's book focus, The New Early Childhood Professional. So this month, join us as we imagine. We are going to imagine universal childcare and universal preschool for our children. Next month, we're going to imagine a stronger public policy framework for children by looking at what some other countries are doing to strengthen the early years. And by April, we'll be imagining what 21st century kindergarten could look like before we turn our attention to innovations in the field and to the impact of the field. Last year, we were so delighted by the thousands of you who joined our inaugural webinar series. So welcome back to each of you. And we welcome those of you who are new to our series, and we invite you to keep coming back. And we thank you for being the leader that you already are for our children and for our early childhood educator professionals. Just like last year, our CAYL webinar series is on topics that we offer as an invitation and as a challenge. We invite you to engage with this topic, and we invite you to imagine a strengthened platform for child development, to innovate changes for our field, and to focus on our solutions and the impact that you can have wherever that you are. And there is perhaps no better trio prepared to kick off this conversation than our powerful panel of pioneers and legends, Dr. Ellen Frede, Dr. Maurice Sykes, and Barbara Kamara. This is a powerful trio, and I am thrilled that they have joined us today on this topic of rhetoric, realities, and roadmaps about universal childcare and universal preschool. So imagine universal childcare and preschool. What would that mean for children and families? What would it take to get there? What are some models that are already in play? So join this conversation with our panel today as we think about these issues. Dr. Ellen Frede is Senior Co-Director at NEAR at Rutgers University. Barbara Kamara, Barbara Ferguson Kamara is the Chief Strategy Officer at the DC Early Learning Coalition. And Dr. Maurice Sykes is a Senior Associate in the Early Childhood Leadership Institute. And for many, many decades, these three have not only talked about universality, they have worked hard to achieve it. Now, this webinar is only an hour, so we invite your questions and reflections throughout the presentation. After this webinar, you'll get a follow-up email that has a lot of resources so that you can dig deeper into this conversation. And in response to popular demand, at the end of this webinar, you'll have the option of staying online, clicking a link that we'll provide you in the chat if you want to have some dialogue with our powerful panel. Please note that this webinar is recorded so that others in different time zones or who are doing the work with children right now can enjoy it at a later date. Closed captioning is also available. And we encourage you to write in the chat and let us know what you're thinking and your reactions to what you hear so that our panelists can address it. And as always, at CAYL, we're learning lessons about leadership, and we have written a step-by-step guide to how each of us can be an architect of change based on our experience of working with leaders in the field. So we invite you to help us think about this important topic. We want to clear up some of the mythologies and rhetoric about universal childcare in preschool. We're going to talk about how it's working positively with Head Start and private providers. It's not compulsory. And if we ever do have universal childcare and universal preschool in this country, it is going to require thousands of new settings and classrooms. So what will it take? Let's imagine, what would it take? And as we realize universal childcare, universal preschool, our vision is that it will work to help close the achievement gap, that it will help to create demand for more highly compensated teachers, and that it will increase the private-public investment in our children. So let's get started with our panel today. They're going to speak in the order of Ellen, Barbara, and Maurice. Following this, we're going to have an interactive dialogue before we close out and invite you to join us in a private conversation with our panelists by clicking the link that you will get in the chat. So let's now begin by putting a spotlight on Dr. Ellen Frede, who's going to start the conversation for us today. Welcome, Ellen. It's such a pleasure for us to have you here with us today.
And it's a great pleasure to me to be able to speak on this topic and with such fun and great colleagues who I've known for quite some time and have worked and argued with and played with over the years. I want to start by just saying I was asked to differentiate between universal childcare and universal preschool and kind of set out some of the landscape of what's going on within the states and where we have universality. And I want to start with just saying we don't have universality in childcare, and but talk some about how we could and mention a few countries that do. I will also talk a little bit about some of my concerns with what's currently being talked about in the field in terms of an articulated system. And then I'll finally end with telling you about the targeted universal program that we implemented in New Jersey, and a little bit about some of the promises that are to come in New Jersey that we're excited about. So when Valora first asked me to be on this panel, she first talked about universal childcare, and then she talked about universal pre-K, and then it became universal childcare again. And I was kind of confused. And I think that it's really a great confusion because we really should be thinking about universally serving the needs of children and families. And yet right now, the reality is not that. So let me begin by just teasing out what I see as what's happening with universal preschool and universal childcare. And they vary. A universal childcare system is going to be different by age, because we're talking about all the children's childcare needs, not just the pre-K years. Universal childcare also and universal pre-K vary by eligibility, but also they fundamentally vary by purpose, but they don't have to. So let's start with that issue of the purpose of the funding. So in the purpose of childcare funding, when states and the federal government fund childcare, is to afford parents with the opportunity to work and go to training and know that their child is taken care of while they're doing that. It's rarely funded adequately to be high quality education. That doesn't mean it's not, because people do lots of extraordinary things to improve the quality of their programs, but rarely the funds that are coming down are enough to do a high quality program. Pre-K, on the other hand, provides inadequate care for most family needs if they are working. But it can offset some of the costs of childcare. It's intended to be an educational intervention, but it also is often not funded well enough to actually be of high quality. And for example, there can also be disparities within the system of pre-K where public school teachers are getting paid parity, but teachers in childcare or Head Start receiving the same funding for the state-funded pre-K are not getting the pay parity, and which creates inequities just within a system, within a state or a city. Obviously, the auspices vary somewhat too, although with childcare, it tends to be in centers homes, but rarely in schools. With pre-K, most state and city-funded pre-K programs are mixed delivery, but we just published a brief about this. They rarely take place in homes. So there's when we talk about universal pre-K, we are talking about different funding and also different auspices. They don't have to be, I'm just telling you what the landscape is right now. The other issue that they vary on is eligibility for public dollars, the child's eligibility to receive the program. So childcare is, with a few other exceptions, mostly based on family income and whether or not the parents work. The other big requirement is that the parents be documented. For pre-K, it can often be targeted by income, but often but what we see a lot with state programs, they label themselves as universal pre-K, but then they don't provide adequate funds to be universal. So a lot of states that say they have a universal program may serve as few as 60% of the children, and they have waiting lists. It's not that the families don't want their children to go to the program. There just aren't enough slots and there's not enough funding. New York State is a particularly troubling example of that, where they've called it universal pre-K for decades and never met universality. New York City is an exception to that. They're very close to universal, and they do have universal access in the sense that there's no demographic characteristics or family characteristics that determine eligibility. It's just whether you live within the confines of the city. Georgia has what is in name a universal program, but it is underfunded, so they serve a lower percentage than the demand. And in New Jersey, we had a universal targeted program where we have universality within certain districts, and I'll talk more about this later. But unfortunately, it's been flat funded for the last 10 years, and we now that universality is eroding within those school districts and their partners. It also varies on universal. The definition of universal can vary. It can be about universal access, but families still pay, or it can actually be universal. Or it can be universal that anyone can have access, but there aren't enough slots for everybody. So it's not universal in the sense that everyone gets in. The other way that universal sometimes varies is by the hours per week. And a few states have programs that provide access for up to, say, 10 hours a week, and you can vary how you take those 10 hours, but you would have to pay for anything more than that. And Colorado's new program that just got voted in by the public is one of those programs. It's 10 hours, and as they're trying to figure out how to implement that and how to ensure that the families that the children that need it the most are getting a more robust program than just 10 hours a week, but it's something to build from. And the argument behind it is the same as that for universal education. We have universal access to education, so many believe that we should have universal access to this education program as well. The one place where we can find universal high quality childcare is in some European countries and also somewhat a smattering of East Asian countries. So they actually combine good funding with educational requirements, with high fund, with access to the hours parents work. It may be inadequate for some parents, but it's at least the full work day, the regular work day. But parents with non-traditional hours may have trouble meeting. So that's the basic landscape of universal pre-K versus universal childcare. We could easily do universal childcare if we had the will, and that universal childcare could change children's educational trajectories if we had the political will to do it. One of my concerns with thinking about a universal childcare system is if it gets divorced from the education system. We know from all the research that we've done on the benefits of pre-K that you don't always get benefits. And there's been famously a study that just came out last week that showed that illustrates that. But one thing we do know is that it's very hard to get those benefits if there's not good continuity and articulation with K3. And so one of the things, if we're thinking about going to a universal childcare system, is ensuring that we have that continuity and coherence of approach. So now I'm going to switch to telling you about the targeted universal program in New Jersey and what we built, and then a little bit about where we are now and where we're hoping it will go. So New Jersey's program is about 20 years old. In the beginning, it was a robust universal program with 6 hours of pre-K funded by the Department of Education, with wraparound childcare before and after the program and in the summer for families that needed it, that was also funded by the government. So it was really a universal childcare system in those designated districts. The designated districts were those with the highest poverty rates in the state. But all children who resided in those districts were eligible to attend the program. And what we were able to put in place was a coherent system that coordinated learning standards with assessment with curriculum district-wide. The program was delivered in mixed deliveries, so childcare, Head Start, and public school classrooms were all funded at the same level and had the same policy standards. Teachers had pay parity regardless of where they taught, and they all used the same they all used the same curriculum, and they got all the same kinds of supports. There was a strong effort for continuity with K3. It was not always successful, but that was part of the initiative from the Department of Education. I neglected to tell you that I was in charge of pre-K expansion from 2002 to 2005 in New Jersey. So some of these things are things that we built as we were there. And I saw that many of my partners in building this are on the webinar today. So that was exciting to see some names of people who helped build this program. There were resources and support provided for the workforce, the current workforce, to obtain their bachelor's degree and certification in early childhood education. So scholarships were provided and also supports from the school district. And the system provided in-classroom support for improving your teaching and implementing the curriculum. There's also specialized support for dual language learners and for children with disabilities included in the general education classroom. Another important aspect of the New Jersey pre-K program is that we had a very small class size of only 15, and children got 2 years of pre-K when they were 3 and 4. We have studied the program since 2005, and that cohort of children, our last analysis, they were in the 10th grade, and they continued to outperform the children who did not attend the pre-K program, and 2 years were twice as good as 1 in those achievement. And this is across all the domains of learning. We also reduced special education placement and reduced grade retention. So it's a pretty successful program that was done universally. And by the way, it's only, when we say it's 31 school districts, that's about 20% of the population of the state. So it was not it was over 40,000 children. So it's not a small program by any means, even though it wasn't statewide. Currently, with the flat funding, we now see a reduction in standards. Even though the policies say they have to be there, districts aren't meeting them, and they also are having waiting lists, which is a great concern to us. And one of the things to work into any program is to ensure that the funding has an automatic increase to follow either the CPO. I don't. Sorry, the CPI, the Consumer Price Index, or some other marker. And we are hoping that we are going to be able to remedy this issue of funding and get back to our original standards in the context of the governor's announcement for universal pre-K in New Jersey, which will be rolled out over a series of years, but we're in the midst of working on the details of the strategic plan for that, for universal pre-K in New Jersey, which would be very exciting. It is now my pleasure to turn this over to CEO Barbara Kamara, who will tell us about the history and system that has been built in DC, which, by the way, I didn't say anything about, but it is the poster child for universality.
Thank you so much, Ellen. And thank you also to Dr. Washington and your team for providing this opportunity for us to come and share. I want to start with a quote from someone who is certainly known to many of you. And he said, DC continues to be a leader in preschool access for 3- and 4-year-olds and in spending, according to Dr. Steve Barnett, NEAR's founder and senior co-director. Our free full-day pre-K in DC served 64% of 3-year-olds and 85% of 4-year-olds without regard to income during FY 2021. So that's kind of like the end of the story. But I want to, in a short time, talk to you about the historical context in DC, factors that contributed to universal pre-K legislation and implementation, and lessons learned. There's a case study that has been written on the DC story, and you will have access to that information. So to help you fill in for these real bullet points that I'll be sharing today. So what's the historical context? DC has always been a pioneer in early childhood education. Back in 1964, DC was a pilot test site for the National Head Start program. And this continued the long time attention to at-risk preschoolers. In 1972, Washington, DC became one of the first jurisdictions in the country to offer pre-K for 4-year-old children in a public school setting. In 1979, the Mayor's Advisory Committee on Early Childhood Development was established by Mayor Marion Barry. And this entity provided a forum for policy and program input involving the entire community. It met regularly. It was abolished, however, in 2009. In 2008, the City Council of the District of Columbia passed the Pre-K Enhancement and Expansion Act of 2008. It was designed to ensure that all 3- and 4-year-old children had access to high quality pre-kindergarten programs. And the original version of the legislation did include birth to 3, but it was removed because at that point, the council couldn't link birth to 3 to the public good that it saw for pre-K 3 and 4. The 2008 Act was the culmination of decades. We were not overnight wonders. Decades of activism by the DC early childhood community, including a spirited 2.5-year campaign for universal pre-K carried out by Pre-K for All DC and supported by national funder Pre-K Now and local philanthropic sources. And the DC Early Learning Collaborative is the successor to Pre-K Now. So there are 5 critical factors as we move down our road to universal pre-K legislation in DC. The first is that we established a universal school readiness stakeholder group 5 years prior to the enactment of the legislation. This group included everyone who was engaged in the whole comprehensive services related to young children. And we had the opportunity to bring in people who had research, people who were implementing positive programs, and people who might be doing something that we imagined that we might do in our own program. We kept a big tent. Then there were 2 individuals. The second critical factor is 2 individuals who were the face of our campaign, were well known. They were highly respected in the educational, business, philanthropic, political, and community arenas. The third critical factor was a strategic ward organizing strategy. Now, DC, the next state, our wards would be like counties. And so we were reaching out to the whole broad-based group of people to ensure that they were aware of what pre-K was, that they were educated, having all the background knowledge, and ultimately move to action to ensure that we had a program. Then our fourth critical factor was a coherent and dynamic multi-level communications plan. When you're engaged in as many activities as we were and trying to achieve a targeted goal, we needed to have someone to help us with the messaging. So we hired a firm that helped us with developing the plan and implementing the plan. And the fifth critical factor was sustained senior leadership in the public schools, city government, and the legislative branch. DC was very fortunate at that time through our early education and pre-K system and programmatically, because we had sustained senior leadership in the public schools and in the government. In public schools, Maurice Sykes, at the helm of our public school early childhood for many years. And then on the executive side of the government, Barbara Kamara was leading governmental childcare efforts for over 20 years under 4 mayors. And then on the legislative side, in the 2008 Pre-K Act, it was led by Council Chairman Vincent C. Gray, who later became the mayor and ensured implementation of the law inside the government, and who in 2018 crafted the B3 for All DC Act, which was built on the success of the pre-K law. We also had a pilot program in DC, piloting pre-K in community-based settings, designed by Maurice and Cia Barbara and Carrie Thornhill and others in DC. So what are some lessons learned from this decade-long work? So although the 2008 pre-K legislation passed unanimously, we had to be vigilant about monitoring the pace of implementation by government, because the government took its own time in responding to the basic requirements in the legislation. And as advocates and activists, we had to elevate this. And so in 2010, the City Council passed the Pre-K Acceleration and Clarification Emergency Amendment Act of 2010. And this amended the original Pre-K Enhancement and Expansion Act of 2008. And it really put the district back on track in critical areas of implementation. So although you get the legislation, you can't sit back on that. You do have to monitor and hold people accountable. The second lesson is that we should have continued convening and educating the coalition developed during the pre-K time to ensure that there was a focus on quality and compensation. So while we are #1 in terms of access and spending, we still have a lot of work to do in terms of quality. And of course, you've heard the news lately, we are doing something about compensation. There was almost a 5-year gap between the pre-K law's passage and the beginning of data gathering, coalition rebuilding, and focusing on resurfacing the voices of early educators. We also should have consistently implemented our inside-outside strategy. We engaged everyone. We worked within government, with people who were partners, helping people who weren't partners see themselves as partners. And we also worked on the outside across all sectors of the community. And the third lesson, we were promised compensation back in 2008. However, that was not realized until the Birth to 3 for All DC legislation was passed in 2018. And here we are in 2022, beginning to actually implement that. And we are trying also to apply the lessons learned from pre-K to our Birth to 3 legislation. And the fourth lesson learned, we should have continued our strategic communications to and with our multiple publics. You can't tell people how important it is to start early. And you need to keep telling them that. You have to educate them, and then you have to help them understand that with the public will, we can make this happen. And that certainly did happen in DC. And so now I'd like to turn it over to Dr. Maurice Sykes, who has been a mentor, a coach, and a partner for 3 decades. Maurice.
Thank you, Cia Barbara. And for those of you who do not know, Barbara and I are considered the Bobsey twins of early childhood education here in Washington, DC. And so it is really a pleasure to be a part of this panel. And we were invited by Valora, Dr. Washington, to imagine. And so I would like for us to imagine the promise of pre-K. Imagine pre-K fulfilling its promise of quality programs for all children. And I start with the right of the child. Imagine children having access to high quality programs that are engaging and challenging and robust in their content, with adults who respect the children who respect themselves and one another. Imagine the focus on the child in pre-K programs that are just and equitable. Imagine programs where boys, and particularly boys of color, are not suspended or expelled. Imagine the child as a capable, competent, resourceful learner. Imagine delivering the same high quality programs to children regardless of surname or home language or race or ethnicity. Imagine. And then imagine positive outcomes for children in school and in life. That is the promise of pre-K. And that's what we have to deliver on. So all of our talk and discussion about universal pre-K, I ask, universal for what? Universal for who? Universal when? Universal how? And universal must be just and equitable. The second consideration as we imagine is to imagine the right of the teacher. We've imagined the right of the child. Now let's imagine the right of the teacher. And as Sia Barbara said earlier, you know, in the work that we have done in Washington, D.C., we did not just raise the bar for teachers in terms of credentials and degrees. We also included in that legislation dollars, non-lapsing dollars for teachers to pursue their credential or their degree. And so imagine teachers who are prepared, because the outcomes for children will not be realized unless we have three things going. We need highly qualified and prepared teachers. We need highly compensated teachers for equal pay, for equal work, for equal credentials. And we need highly competent teachers. Not enough to pay more if we're not going to get more. And our multiple publics will hold us accountable in terms of where's the beef. What are the outcomes? And I know a lot of early childhood people shy away from accountability. They don't want to be measured, and you can't tell what a child is doing because of development and blah, 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 blah. All that may be true, but if we take the money, we have to be willing to be accountable. And, you know, we were just talking in this pre-webinar discussion about, you know, recent reports from Tennessee, and the data doesn't look so good. And now we need to drill down in that data and find out what's going on, because there are variables, but people are looking at this work. So it's not just a money grab. It is in service to children, in service to children and families. And therefore, we have to imagine ourselves being accountable. So the three-legged stool, when I think about the right of children and the right of the teacher has a right to be highly trained and prepared through, not through their own resources, but through public resources that provide them scholarship money to get the degrees or credentials that we're asking for. They have a right to be highly compensated for the work that they do, equal pay for equal work, for equal credentials. And they have the right to be competent, to master their craft, to be an early childhood educator par excellence. That is the right of the teacher. And then we have the right of children and families. And that right is that parents should know that wherever they send their children for early care and education, that their child will be provided with what we consider a world-class experience, that we will not subject their children to what is called the pedagogy of poverty, where we treat and teach children in a different way, where we spend a lot of time in what we call sitting and getting and spraying and praying. without any thought or forethought or plans for taking children at higher levels. We often talk about, in my work, people talk about gifted and talented. All children are gifted and talented. And the same experiences that we provide for children from more affluent neighborhoods are the same experiences that we should be providing for all children. And so it is with those three, the right of the child, the right of the teacher, and the right of family and parents. And now I think we will transition to having an open discussion. There's been a lot of provocations that we have put out there for you, and now it's your turn.
Right, lots of provocations. I'm excited by what I'm hearing, and I am imagining that we can do so much better for our children. We can do the right thing for our children. We can do the right thing for our workforce, because the people who are teaching young children and being with young children every day deserve so much better than we're offering them right now. I want to thank each of the three of you once again for the trailblazing work that you have done in this field. You are the courageous leaders on which we are building this profession, and I really thank you for that. Imagine, this is what we can do. This is what we will do. And we see that it takes time, it takes effort, it takes organizing, it takes advocacy, it takes activists. That's how it gets done. This is not going to be a gift that drops down on us from heaven. We have to work for it. What do you think, Ellen, about what you've been hearing?
Well, I first am very grateful that you let me go before Sia, Barbara, and Maurice, because they're both a hard act to follow. But I was thinking about all of our careers in early childhood education, and thinking about, was it just yesterday or 2 days ago when we had Groundhog Day, and feeling a little bit, I think we just have to realize we are making such progress. When I think back to when I began my career and what our hopes were, and the progress that we've made, but it's been very slow. And that coalition building is so critical that you talk about, Valora. But I'm hopeful that we're ready now for the speedy version of this, and that we won't be needing, that there won't be so many more generations of children who aren't provided adequate and high quality educational experiences when they're little.
Well, thinking of speedy, I'm going to ask two questions that I'm sure are on the minds of our listeners. One is about Build Back Better. Is it going to deliver universality to us? I know that many people in the field are thinking that if it were to pass. Is that true? And I also want to ask you all to just go back and talk about infants and toddlers and all of this as well. So these are two issues I'd just love to hear both of you, all three of you, talk about.
Well, go ahead.
No, I know you want to take the Build Back Better piece.
Yes, I do.
Right ahead.
So go ahead with infants and toddlers, Barbara.
Well, in DC, as I indicated, we started out with the legislation that had birth to 3 in it. But our city council people, despite our bringing in people from New Jersey and all the researchers and all of that, they didn't grasp that as being the foundation that it is to later success. And so we finally got this law in 2018. But it's followed some of the same patterns that the 2008. We had to continue to monitor it and continue to push and to continue to get the educators to understand that they have a significant role to play in this. I think we are now at a point where they'll get some compensation, but educators who work with all children, and particularly educators who work with the infants and toddlers, should be standing up, helping people to understand the significance of the work that they do. Not only is it beneficial to parents and to the broader community, but it is beneficial to the children, and to help educators get their voices. And I know you had a program earlier about this, but that is really and truly significant as we think about babies and their families.
Yeah, people still aren't hearing the message about infants and toddlers. Maurice, what were you going to add to this?
Well, I was going to talk about Build Back Better. You know, I think that I'm not sure Ellen and I had this conversation before. So I don't know that we're going to get the legislation. But what I do know in terms of phenomena and policy is that there is widespread support in this country for universal pre-K. That's how the field has grown. And the reason I'm ambivalent is because we all look at the national political scene, but you know, this is not our first time at the rodeo, you know, in terms of public interest and early childhood from the Lanham Act. And I'm writing a book right now. So, I mean, the Lanham Act, where all the women were called forward to provide pretty much universal, for that day and time, it was universal. But when the men came home, the women were sent home, as I write in my, and so we've had that. And then we had the Comprehensive Child Development Act, when there was bipartisan support for universal pre-K, and it was vetoed by President Nixon. And so here we are once again. And what I would hope, whether it is legislated or not, and this is something that we haven't talked about, but all of the people who are participants, as you can see, we're ready to pass the torch. What we need are what you call agents of change, Valora. We need change agents who will pick up the torch that Ellen and Barbara and I have been carrying and carry it on. I mean, that's really because it takes activism and concentration and political know-how and stratifying. And so rather than give pat answers, my thing is you all need to get together. And many of you are working already. I'm not taking anything away, but we need to rethink and reimagine how we bring about public policy, so we don't have these islands like New Jersey and Georgia and DC, but that it is universal. I also encourage us to look at other entities or other fields that are low wage and low status. I'm calling for building a coalition across fields of practice.
So I just want to explain I'm just a little more optimistic than Maurice. And what I'm obviously what I'm hoping for is the whole Build Back Better miraculously gets voted for. But I do think there are some efforts to take certain popular portions of it and put them forward as bills. They can't go through reconciliation that way. So that's what's hard with the divided Congress. But the one thing I think is that all of the 4 child-focused parts of Build Back Better, any of those 4 would be a great win. And so I mean, if we get just the childcare legislation, it would be great. If we get just the pre-K legislation, because if we get just the childcare portion of the bill, we can build pre-K on top of it. If we get just the pre-K, we offset a lot of childcare costs and we can build on top of that. Neither of them, Valora, will get us universality. That's a smoke and mirrors. But they're still good things. But even if we only get the child care tax credit, that's good for families and children. So I'm hopeful that we're going to salvage something from this, because it's very depressing to keep going through this, as Maurice said, the cycle of and may I say a little something about infant and toddler?
Yes, please.
So when we were building the pre-K program in New Jersey, we knew that it was an issue, but we were so excited to have this opportunity to get pre-K and it was a lot of hard work, and we missed the boat with infant toddler. And we don't have data about it. We don't know how it directly impacted the availability of infant toddler care, but we now know we need to be really aware of it. And I think not just that we need the slots in care, but that we need to be focusing on, again, the quality and educational supports that during that time period. I mean, we knew that was an important time period. I'm not saying we didn't understand that. The biggest struggle, and we're working hard on this at NEAR and with a couple of state partners, is defining what that program needs to look like. What are the program standards that you need to have? We know it needs to be better, but we don't have a lot of research to base our thinking about the components of quality. And so that's something that I think is going to be a challenge again for that next generation to think about. But it is a really important one. I keep seeing people in the chat saying family childcare, and yes, we need to figure that piece of it out as well, particularly when we talk about infants and toddlers, but for pre-K as well.
Valora, just one comment about, so that, because everything happens in a political, social, and economic context. And our broad publics were not ready for infant toddler. I mean, what Barbara is not, we were told by the legislators to remove this. And, you know, it has to do with attitudes in this country. And someone wrote in the chat box, you know, we were, during the height of the pandemic, we were first responders, we were needed. And so the country is, but this is political as well, because the prevailing attitude, in spite of 60% of women working outside the home, still the prevailing attitude in this country is a woman's place and children's place is at home, even though people need childcare. I mean that, and we're working up against those attitudes. And there is a cultural shift going on in this country right now that is challenging. In every educational establishment, they haven't come after early childhood yet, but just bide our time. But you know, education is under siege, and we need to keep that in mind. And this is why having partners and collaborators other than just our friends is important, to build a broad, multiple faction. I mean, we build our work in DC on that pre-K helps with school improvement, it helps with workforce development, and it helps with the economic vitality of the city. Now that touches a lot of people. And I'm just saying to people who are a part of this discussion, you have to broaden your base beyond just early childhood.
Right.
So as
And
we're
I just
coming,
wanna-
go ahead, Sia.
I just want to say too that when we look at our birth to 3 legislation in DC, it didn't just focus on the childcare piece. It is comprehensive. It includes, you know, healthy futures and all of the other programs and supports that you need to have a high quality program. And while Ellen talked about the components, certainly that legislation has it. But we also have experience with early Head Start, which is has some of the components that we need to have a high quality program.
As we come to a close of this webinar, I want to remind everyone to look in the chat. We're going to put a link. If you want to be able to get in a conversation with our dynamic panelists, click that link immediately following this webinar, and you'll be able to be in conversation with them. And as we come to a close, I would like to ask each of you, we have so many, hundreds of people listening to this webinar right now, and give them some advice. What can they do? What would you say to them is their call for action? As they're listening to what you're saying, give them some advice, give them some encouragement, give them a roadmap. What can they do next? What do you recommend, each of you?
Well, I certainly recommend that they reach out to others in their community. I mean, so the Gray Panthers, they have an interest in this. Everybody really has an interest, and you can help people to understand how it's in their best interest to participate in this. But reaching out to other people and keep the conversations and dialogues going, and continuing to put before people what we know from the research about what is quality, but help relate it to them and their environment.
Mm-hmm.
Well, I think there are a lot of things, and I definitely endorse what Sia Barbara said, but I think there are many different ways that you can advocate and be a champion. But what just struck me while I was thinking about it is that your local NAEYC chapter is a really great group to get engaged with, and can help and has resources for advocating. There, every state has advocacy organizations you could join. You could, but I feel like if you're part of the early childhood field, that NAEYC and the local chapters are good ways to get engaged at the local level and the national level, for that matter.
And
So
Maurice.
I don't have a roadmap or a prescription, because again, everything happens in its own economic, social, cultural, and educational context. So, but what I would say from the work that I do in systems thinking, and in systems thinking, we say, in order to change a system, you have to study the system that you want to change. And so my words would be, study the system that you want to change and study systems thinking. Those, yeah.
Well, really, I know I'm extending thanks to the three of you on behalf of so many people who are listening to this webinar. Really appreciate it. And once again, please click the link in the chat if you want to be in a conversation with them. As we come to a close, I want to tell you what we're going to be doing next. We're going to be continuing our theme of Imagine, and we are going to next month be talking about global perspectives on early childhood education, imagining what they're doing in other countries, what we might learn from them. We're going to go to thinking about imagining 21st century kindergarten, and then we're going to move on to give examples of how governments are stepping up for children. So I want to thank all of you for learning with CAYL Institute today on behalf of our team. This is a conversation that we hope has sparked you to think about how you can get engaged or more deeply engaged in the work that we're all doing for children and we're all doing for our workforce. And now I want to thank you for coming and ask you, if you want to join the question and answer session, to please click the link in the chat. And we look forward to being with you next month. Thank you and good night.